Pints with Jack, Season 3, Episode 42. After Hours with the Prancing Pony. Good morning and welcome to Pints with Jack, a podcast where normally two enthusiastic C.S. Lewis amateurs get together, share a beverage and discuss a work of C.S. Lewis. But this week, a fresh barrel of ale mysteriously arrived at the Eagle and Child pub. It was sent from an inn located in the town of Bree, accompanied by Alan and Shawn from the Prancing Pony podcast. So if you are unfamiliar with their podcast, firstly, where have you been? But the Prancing Pony podcast is a weekly podcast about the Middle-earth legendarium of J.R.R. Tolkien, hosted by the real-life Lord of the Mark, Shawn E. Marchese, and the Man of the West, Alan Sisto. They are passionate Tolkien enthusiasts who invite listeners to enjoy their detailed exploration of Tolkien's work with smart but straightforward discussion and a heavy dose of humour, not to mention a few song references. In each episode, they cover a chapter of one of Tolkien's works, reading their favourite passages, discussing recurring themes, and highlighting connections to other Middle-earth tales to showcase the rich tapestry woven by the master storyteller, J.R.R. Tolkien. Alan and Shawn, welcome to Pints with Jack.
Thank you so much, David. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much, David. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, although Marie and I inaugurated Tolkien Month last week by discussing the 2019 movie, Tolkien, this, I think, is where we're really going to start getting into the meat of things. In today's episode, Alan and Shawn, they're going to be giving us a really solid introduction to Tolkien's life, his loves, his languages, as well as a sketch of the corpus of his work, particularly focusing on the book which they are currently discussing on their podcast, The Lord of the Rings. However, before we get to that, I need a pint of something. So let's talk about the drink of the week. After all, if more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world.
Indeed.
Hear, hear.
And appropriately enough, inspired by Middle-earth, today I am drinking Dragon's Milk beer. How about you guys?
Well, I hate to be the boring one, so I'm just going to go ahead and go first. I am drinking that fabulous concoction, dihydrogen monoxide. It is fabulously cool, quenching the thirst, and, well, it tastes great.
Hey, there's nothing wrong with that. I can't argue with that. I've been known to imbibe a little dihydrogen monoxide once in a while myself.
I hope so.
But tonight, since we're representing the Prancing Pony, I felt it best to bring in a pint of my own homebrewed ale today.
Homebrew. I love it.
Homebrew. I brew my own beer. I have brewed my own beer for several years now. And I have with me a pint of my own version of an English sort of traditional pub bitter here. And by the way it tastes, I have to say it's probably been laid under an enchantment of surpassing excellence by some wizard. So I think I'm good to go.
That's wonderful.
That is.
It is. Thank you.
So now we've done the drink of the week, let's get on to the quote of the week. And this is an extract from C.S. Lewis's diary, recounting his first meeting with Professor Tolkien. Tolkien was a smooth, pale, fluent little chap. No harm in him. Only needs a smack or so.
Pretty much what I said about Shawn from the beginning, actually.
I'm surprised you called me fluent, but thank you very much.
Your word nerdery proves that. But yeah, it's an occasional smack.
Okay, so the last piece of housekeeping, we need to toast, because in each episode we tend to toast one of the top-tier patron supporters.
Ah, good.
And today we're toasting James Ryder. So, James, may the blessings of elves and men and all free folk go with you wherever you go, and may the stars shine upon your face. Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers, James.
That's excellent. It's great. I love seeing podcasts, really support the folks who support them. I think that's great.
Absolutely. Community is really what it's all about for us.
It's huge.
So, yeah.
Whenever I talk to other podcasters, it's the most consistent thing that people say that they love most about podcasting.
Yeah.
It's because they suddenly end up with all these extra friends that they never knew they had.
Yeah, it really is true.
It's been great.
It really is true. And it's great to be able to make a connection with people. Kind of keeps us going.
It really does.
And also find some fellow nerds on other sides of the planet.
Yep,
everywhere you
too.
go, yes.
So, gentlemen, would you mind introducing yourselves a little bit more to the listeners and filling out a little bit of your backgrounds?
Sure. Shawn, you want to go ahead and first, and I'll jump in?
Yeah, I can do that. So let's see. My background. Well, I live in Texas now, but I am from Louisiana originally. I've been a fan of languages and mythology really since I was a little kid, as long as I can remember. And not to come across as too nerdy this early in the show, but I taught myself a little Greek and Latin as a kid. And my education ended up being in English literature and classical studies. So I dare not compare myself to Tolkien, but we have that in common, that we both started out as classicists. But after I finished college, I decided not to pursue an academic career. I decided to go out into the world. But I've continued doing a lot of reading and a fair bit of writing and even a little film production here and there. And now I'm doing some podcasting. So it's been a fun road.
Yes, it has. I'm from Southern California. I have a varied background, but my day job currently is as a architectural photographer. Not doing a lot of that lately, thanks to the pandemic and all the shutdowns, but thankfully I've been able to pour a lot of time into the podcast as a result. I've been in California all my life, born and raised here. And of course, I've loved Tolkien for as long as I can remember. I think I probably first encountered Tolkien when I was about 10, I imagine. I think it was the Rankin and Bass adaptation of The Hobbit had come out in 1977. And I think I saw it in 1978 or read the book in 1978. So that's when I first encountered Tolkien, and I've absolutely enjoyed reading him every year ever since. And that's definitely the big part of my background that's relevant to the podcast, at least.
I actually discovered Tolkien in 1991. I was 15, which I think is a perfect age for Lord of the Rings. And this was a decade before the Peter Jackson film, so I really didn't have much knowledge of what I was getting into. You know, I can't imagine what it's like for people these days who have a chance to discover the movies before the books. I had none of that, like you, Alan.
Right.
But I'd been a fantasy fan for a long time. D&D and cheap paperback fantasy novels and stuff like that. And I read something about Tolkien one day about how he started writing The Hobbit, and I said, this sounds really cool. I went out and bought a box set of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings and read those straight through. And then I went on into the Silmarillion, and I never really left Middle-earth after that, really.
So you got started pretty early, but at some point it got more serious. And you then decided to start a podcast. How did that happen?
Oh, goodness. That is a fun story.
Yeah. Let me, I'll fill in a little bit here, maybe up until how we met, Alan, because I think that's a fun part of the story.
Okay.
I think we both were kind of reading Lord of the Rings every year for a while. Speaking for myself personally, my next big level up as a Tolkien nerd came when I became a dad. In 2013, I had a son, and I read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings aloud to my son when he was a baby, just to get him to sleep. And that really, after so many years of rereading Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, I suddenly reading it aloud kind of awakened something new for me.
Yeah.
And that started me on a deeper study of Tolkien. I started reading the Carpenter biography and the letters and all the great scholars that we constantly reference on our show. And I started finding myself in Facebook groups, and that's how I managed to meet Alan. Yeah,
that's exactly what happened. We were in a group that was doing regular book week posts, which was a great, really different thing from so many of the other groups that kind of devolved into memes and discussions about movie casts. This group, while it still had plenty of that, did have a few moderators and administrators who wanted to make it more book focused. And so we had these book weeks where we were to take a quote from a particular book. Maybe that week was going to be Fellowship of the Ring, and we would take a quote and talk about it briefly. And what was kind of funny is we kept sort of, intentionally or not, kind of one-upping each other. We realized we were both taking this pretty seriously. So we were like, maybe it was 200 words, and then it was 400 words, and then, we were citing other sources and referencing things. It was pretty funny.
And there were some great posts that people were writing. The best ones were like a short essay. And then Alan and I just started doing these, really long essays and quoting letters and bringing in all these just weird insights that you wouldn't think anybody would care about in a Facebook group. And if nothing else, we started noticing each other. And so we started commenting. And, and I don't know, we just kind of hit it off through that. And then there was something off topic one day about podcasts, wasn't there? I think
there was. I think you said it. You mentioned something about podcasts.
Yeah, no, I'd been really into history podcasts and things like that. And
Right.
I think I'd said something about, oh yeah, podcasts are really cool. I love listening to them. It would be really neat to do one someday. Just some
Right.
offhand comment, the kind of thing you'd just say.
But the timing was perfect because at that exact moment, I'd been doing some voiceover work for about a year, maybe at that point. So I've been doing that a little longer than I've been doing podcasting. And one of my VO coaches suggested that I might become a little more comfortable behind the microphone, a more conversational style, if I did a podcast. And this coach told me, don't worry, nobody will listen. Just talk about whatever you want. I mean, it's not a big deal. Just do a podcast. Which I still remember those words. And I thought, all right. And so for about 2 or 3 weeks, I was thinking, what in the world am I going to podcast about? I mean, I have a lot of different interests, but I'm not sure that any of them are the kind of thing I'd want to talk about for a half an hour or an hour, let alone 2 or sometimes 3 hours as we did in season 1.
And alone, right? I mean, just talking yourself. Yeah.
And alone, that was the thing. That was the big thing. I did not want to do this by myself. And I knew that if I did, it was going to be small. It was going to be, really minimal effort. I didn't want to do something on my own. So I realized, what can I talk about for more than a half
Minimal
an hour
effort. I like
with
that.
somebody? Well, yeah. If I'm going to be by myself, I'm not going to put much into this thing. Right.
Yeah.
So I thought, all right, what am I going to do? Well, Tolkien would be great. But at the time I was listening to Corey Olsen, and he's the Tolkien professor. The Tolkien professor, as Michael Trout might remind us.
Yeah.
And he has a great show. And I was listening to his early stuff, back when he was teaching The Lord of the Rings, teaching The Hobbit at a, undergrad level at Washington College before he, founded Signum and Mythgard and all that. And was probably in the middle of the Silmarillion seminar when this idea came along. And I thought, well, I'd love to do Tolkien, but man, Corey Olsen is already doing a great job. I can't compete with that. He's forgotten more than I'll ever know. I mean, that guy just knows his stuff. But then
he is the Tolkien professor. I mean, that's what you'd expect.
That's right, absolutely. Yeah. With that definite article, I mean, that makes it clear.
Firmly establishing him as the only one.
That's correct. The and only the Tolkien professor. Yeah. So before I talked to Shawn, I thought, all right, I want to have somebody do this with me. If I'm going to do Tolkien, it's got to be a totally different format. I don't want to look like I'm trying to copy Corey Olsen because the 17 people that are going to listen to the show are going to notice that. So I thought, all right, I'll reach out to Shawn because he mentioned this podcast thing and because he's obviously kind of on the same page with me in terms of analysis. He thinks a lot of the same things. He digs deep. He's got a linguistic approach to it that I really appreciate. And he obviously had a little bit of a sense of humor. So I reached out and I said, hey, Shawn, I'm just wondering, do you think you might want to do a podcast on Tolkien someday?
Yeah. And I remember at the time, it was just, maybe we'll do one episode a month or something like that. Yeah. It'll just be like 12 people, 20 people maybe from our Facebook group that'll listen to this thing.
Right.
And so I was like, yeah, that sounds easy enough. Count me in. Yeah. My wife still laughs at me because I sat her down one day and I said, honey, I want to start a podcast with a guy. And she still thinks that's the funniest thing ever. Like I was going to bring some really bad idea to her.
Right.
But yeah, no, we just kind of, we jumped in the booth one day. We did a little bit of promotional stuff, just kind of told people what we were doing. And then we recorded our first episode. And then we quickly realized that no, monthly isn't going to work. We're going to try and do this thing bi-weekly. No. And then after a season of that, we said we really would like to get to weekly if we can. And
our patrons did that. That was our first goal.
Thanks to some amazing support on Patreon. Yeah, we've been able to do that.
And what kind of stuff do you actually go through for people who haven't listened to your podcast?
Well, we are definitely a chapter-by-chapter walkthrough. We started with the idea of doing a chapter per episode, but what we really do now is about 6 to 7 pages per episode. So we have slowed our pace down considerably. I think we did the Silmarillion in, I don't know, season 1 had 52 episodes, but probably about 45 of those were actually textual based.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah,
because we had some interviews and a couple specials and things like that. But yeah, we just do a few pages at a time, and we usually have an introductory segment where we talk about something like This Week in Tolkien History, where we talk about things that happened in his life, or maybe meanwhile elsewhere in Middle Earth. So we kind of take a glance at other timelines that are happening parallel. My favorite is Shawn's Philology Fair, when he digs deep into a particular word that we're going to encounter in that episode. Tolkien fun facts, things like that.
That's always a fun one, yeah.
Yeah. So we have an introductory segment, and then we have the bulk of our discussion, which is about an hour to an hour and a half. And then we have the mailbag. So we answer questions from people.
And our discussion is really just us reading a passage at a time, and then just kind of talking through major themes that we see, interesting bits of linguistics, interesting bits of Middle-earth history that are worth pointing out, that we think are really relevant to the passage in question, interesting philosophical stuff, theological stuff. I mean, it's just really anything that sort of catches our eye that we think would work for interesting reading and sort of bring a little bit more to the text.
And we especially like to bring things together from other works of Tolkien.
Yeah.
And when Lord of the Rings came out, the Silmarillion didn't exist. And that's the reason why we did the Silmarillion in season 1, was to give people that foundation. But it's great to be able to tie things back. So when Bilbo finds Sting in The Hobbit, or when Frodo gets to Rivendell in The Lord of the Rings, we can talk about those things and those people from a first or second age perspective and bring in that extra information. So it's a lot of fun. We definitely, I think one way to put it is that we take the material seriously, but we don't take ourselves seriously. And we definitely have a lot of fun on the show, a lot of laughs, definitely enjoyable, fun times. It's supposed to be as much entertaining as it is educational.
And you learn not only about Middle-earth, but about pop and rock references.
Definitely classic rock and prog rock for sure, yeah.
Now, speaking for myself, I've been podcasting for a few years now, and I would definitely say that it has changed me, and it's also changed my appreciation of C.S. Lewis. So I was wondering, how has running your podcast changed you and your appreciation of the professor?
Oh, wow. Shawn, that's a big, big question, but it's a good one, yeah.
It is a great question. I mean, I feel like for me, it's given me a broader perspective on Tolkien's work.
Yes.
I think as a reader, reading a work in isolation, I think you connect with whatever particular aspect of the story that you connect with. You bring your own baggage and your own applicability to the story, and you find something you like. For me, it was always the languages and the elves and the mythology from the Silmarillion. But then when you're talking about a podcast for a general audience, you really have to be a generalist. And I feel like that has kind of made me aware of things that I would not have necessarily picked up on. It opens my eyes to stuff that I never noticed before. Things like fate and free will, or the nature of evil, or how much astronomy there really is in Lord of the Rings. Things like that.
Quite a bit.
That I wouldn't necessarily have picked up on. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't still have our own particular hobby horses. As Alan said, I'm a little bit obsessed with the language, and I kind of bring that stuff in as often as I can. But I don't know. I think it kind of forces you outside of that narrow perspective, and it kind of, again, just opens your eyes to other stuff. I don't know. What about you, Alan?
I absolutely concur with that. That's something that I've noticed as well. When I used to read Tolkien, I just would get totally engrossed in that story, in that moment of that story. And as a podcaster, I can't afford to do that. I have to get out and above. I have to kind of take this 30,000-foot overview. I have to be able to zoom in, but I have to be able to zoom way out and to tie it together to things from the first age, the second age. I also have to be able to tie it to things in the primary world and talk about real-world influences in terms of maybe history, for example, the Dead Marshes and No Man's Land in World War I. Or we could talk about literary influences and some of the bones in the soup, as it were. So doing the podcast has really broadened my horizons in terms of Tolkien as both a man and a professor and a writer, and also just the works as a whole, taking the legendarium and even more than that, because sometimes we often refer to Smith of Wooten Major or Leaf by Niggle, even in the middle of the Lord of the Rings. So it doesn't have to even be the legendarium itself.
Yeah, you start to see how those lesser works, they're all written by the same man, and there are the same themes show up throughout. And you'll get a very different perspective on something in Lord of the Rings by reading something like Leaf by Niggle or Smith of Wooten Major. Absolutely.
One quick illustration of that, when and this was a Facebook post, actually. I think it was one of the ones that I wrote around the time we started. When I was reading The Homecoming of Beorhtnoth, Beorhthelm's son, and realized how closely that story paralleled that of Turin, and it really revealed what Tolkien thought of that behavior. Now, just to give you a brief Reader's Digest version of that, in that story, which is based on the real-life Battle of Malden, the Norsemen, the Vikings, were invading, and they were on this peninsula, and there was only this very narrow little spit of land to the mainland, and it could be blocked by one person, and it had been blocked. And they weren't able to invade, they weren't able to attack. And essentially he challenged the English, the Anglo-Saxon warrior to fight a fair fight. Let his men come across, and then they would fight a fair fight. And of course, the Anglo-Saxons got their butts kicked. And Tolkien's view on this was that was stupid. Your responsibility was to take care of the people that you're leading and to take care of the people that you're protecting. Your responsibility was not to be chivalrous and to have a fair fight. And then you realize that it's so similar to what Turin did in giving up his ability to defend Nargothrond by building that massive bridge across the river, which allowed for it to be invaded and destroyed and sacked. And that tie-in from a legendarium to a non-legendarium piece was just eye-opening. And you see those kinds all the time. And
it goes even deeper than that, because remember when we started out book 2 of Lord of the Rings, that is the second book of Fellowship of the Ring, for those who don't know, we saw a very close parallel to that same idea with Boromir. As Boromir is leaving Rivendell and he blows his horn and he's doing this and they say, dude, why did you blow that horn? You're letting everybody around, every orc around for miles know that we're leaving Rivendell. And he says, I just always do this whenever I'm going out on a quest. And it's like, it's his chivalrous thing to do.
Right.
It's just this sort of kind of manly thing to do. And yeah, it's virtuous and it's brave, but it's like, it's not wise. It's not prudent.
Wise. Yeah.
And stupid is the word you're looking for.
Yeah,
is the word I'm looking for. Yes.
I've gotten so much flack for beating up on Boromir this season. I'm trying to be gentle.
Well,
but yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's that kind of stuff. You see how these themes sort of echo throughout Tolkien's works in the Legendarium and out of the Legendarium, and it's just fascinating.
So let's talk about the man himself. As I said, since this is really the first episode where people are really going to be being introduced to his works if they haven't read them or experienced them already, can you just give us a bit of a sketch of Tolkien's life? Who is the man? What do we need to know about him, his life, his family, his work, if we want to really dig into him and read him for all he's worth?
Well, I think, the first thing you just need to know a little bit about his background, right? Know about his history. Born in 1892 in Bloemfontein, which is now in part of South Africa, but it was then the Orange Free State.
Which was a British colony, yeah.
Right, it was a British colony. His dad was a bank manager, and when he was 3, Tolkien went to England with his family, because was somebody sick? I'm trying to remember.
He was sick. Yeah, it was I think it was something about the climate.
I think it was his brother.
It was the heat or the
yeah. They thought that the humidity would help.
I thought, was it his brother? I thought it was Ronald himself, but
it might have been. It was one of them.
Yeah, but I mean, I know the babies just weren't doing very well in the African heat, and so their mother Mabel took them to England. And this was, he was what, 2 or 3, maybe
3.
Almost
he was
right
3,
about 3, yeah. And so she took the boys to Birmingham supposed to be just a short time, wasn't it?
Right. But unfortunately, while they were there, his father passed away. And so they were now stuck in England with no income. And it was a really tough time. Later on, his mom converted to Roman Catholicism, and at that time in England, that was not, an okay thing for her family. They disowned her. She was not able to get any source of help, any revenue to raise the boys. So he was very strongly influenced by Father Francis Morgan. And of course, if you've seen the film, and you talked about the film last week on the episode, so, it's not Colm Meaney, it's Francis Morgan, but
he'll always be the chief to me.
Yeah, I kept waiting for Picard to come around the corner and or at least Commander Sisko, one or the other.
But she really raised the boys strongly Catholic, didn't she? I mean, she did. She was a very devout Catholic, and she raised the boys that way.
Quite. It seemed like when she made that conversion, it was full-fledged. Yeah. I mean, there was no turning back for her. So now she was going to embrace it wholly, and she really did.
And she was a huge influence on those boys all sorts of ways, not just religion, but for Tolkien, I mean, she taught him languages. She taught him French. She taught him Latin. She read the story of Sigurd to him, so she was really instrumental in him falling in love with the stories from Norse mythology that he became associated with. I mean, sounds like just an amazing woman and had such an impact on his life. And yet she was only in it for a short time.
That's correct.
She died of complications from diabetes in, was it
1904?
1904. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So Ronald was 12, and that's when Father Francis Morgan stepped in as the boy's guardian.
Right. And she had a tremendous influence on him. As Shawn mentioned, she knew so much and was able to teach him so much. Everything from botany to art to languages. He was able to read, if I remember correctly, by the age of 4, he was reading and was able to write shortly after that. Just incredible, obviously gifted, very, very gifted. But his mother was able to teach him a lot. And I think one thing you'll see as we then mention the influence that his wife, Edith, had, he had such tremendous respect for these two women, these two incredible women in his life, for his mother, Mabel, and then for Edith Bratt, who he would marry, at a relatively young age, though probably not as young as he would have liked. I think it was clear they should have gotten married a little sooner, but Father Morgan did keep them from communicating for a little while because he felt like Tolkien was a little too young. The movie took some liberties with their story. They actually got married before he went off to the war, but the love tale, everything we know about it to be true is true. They were madly in love.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a classic teenage romance in a lot of ways. I mean, she was...
Oh, yeah. Forbidden.
She was a little bit older than him. She was 3 years older than him.
Yeah.
They were actually living in the same boarding house together. So,
right.
After Mabel died, Father Francis put the Tolkien boys in a boarding house owned by a Mrs. Faulkner. And one of the other tenants of the boarding house was Edith Bratt, who was... Right. I think she was 19 at the time, and Tolkien was 16.
That's correct. Yep, that is
right. And she was illegitimate. She was an illegitimate child living with Mrs. Faulkner, playing the piano to entertain Mrs. Faulkner. And the two kids just hit it off, And I think, you kind of hinted at the fact, Alan, that Father Francis didn't really want Ronald seeing Edith, and I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that he was Catholic and she was Protestant, and at that time, those things were a very big deal.
They mattered, they really did.
Yeah,
and in fact, that was one of the conditions of their engagement was that she convert to Catholicism.
Right.
So that was a big thing for her to have to do.
Yeah, but it's a very sweet love story. What you get in the pages of like Humphrey Carpenter's biography.
If you want to learn more than our 10-minute overview, please, that's the one to start with. I mean, there are other great biographies out there. Raymond Edwards, Tolkien, John Garth's Tolkien and the Great War, are phenomenal works, and I recommend them highly. But if you're only going to read one, start with Humphrey Carpenter's. It's just a great overview.
Yeah,
gives you good insight.
Definitely.
And you guys have a complete bibliography on your website, right?
Yeah, we do. We have links to all of them. We have little descriptions, and
we have a library of every book we've ever mentioned on our show, which is.
A lot now.
quite a lot of books. Yeah.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Okay, so you've given a little bit of background to the man, the love of his life. They get married. They have a family.
Yes.
Before we leave his family and talk a little bit more about his writing, I'd like to talk about his writing in his family. A couple of years ago, when I was back in Oxford, I saw an exhibition where they showed the letters that he wrote as Father Christmas to his own children. He did this for like decades.
Making all fathers feel bad everywhere. Yeah.
Everywhere. Every Christmas, I feel terrible.
The effort that he put into these things. He wrote, for folks who don't know, he wrote them, he illustrated them. There was a legendarium of the North Pole in these letters. There's recurring characters.
He even wrote them in different scripts because the North Polar Bear would write part of it, and then this elf would write part of it, and then somebody else.
Ilbereth the elf, as if that doesn't sound familiar to anybody who's read Lord of the Rings. All these recurring characters and these stories of goblin wars, and I mean it's right on brand for J.R.R. Tolkien.
It is.
I have to say.
Yeah.
I'm getting married very soon, and when I first learned about that, I immediately started feeling like a terrible father before I've even had children.
Yeah.
I need to go and take some writing classes, and then maybe they'll have an okay childhood.
Yeah. You think to yourself, what have I done for my kids lately?
Right. That is so true. It is a phenomenal thing that he did. And of course, that volume is available. There are visual aids in the book, right? You actually get to see not only the text of the letters written as a book, but you get to see the letters themselves. So you see the flowing script that he used, or the blocky script for North Polar Bear, including grammatical errors and spelling errors on purpose because he's a bear.
Oh, yeah. North Polar Bear is a terrible speller.
Stuff.
Yeah. And there's even some Elvish in there. There's even some Elvish letters, some Tengwar in there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean the world of Middle Earth that he wrote about, it sort of permeated every facet of his life.
It did.
Right down to the letters he wrote to his children, and well, as we'll get into in a moment, I'm sure the stories he told his children.
Well, and you realize that that's partly because he started writing those stories very early. When you do some of the history on the Silmarillion, you learn that he started to write some of these things in 1916, 1917, as a young man in the trenches of World War I, before he had kids. Yes, after he got married to Edith, but before they started to have children. So these stories were fermenting in his mind for decades before they ever found their way onto paper. So, yeah, it's amazing stuff to see that kind of that kernel in the Father Christmas letters and realize what would later come of that.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that. What did Tolkien do? What was his job, and where did all of these stories come from, and the languages that he invented? Can you unpack that a little bit, please?
How long do we have?
Right. Yeah, I guess he's best known for his long tenure at Oxford as a professor of Anglo-Saxon, primarily language, but also literature. His focus was always primarily linguistic. He was a philologist, which is kind of an old-fashioned word now for somebody who studies the history of languages and the intersection of language and folklore and mythology and all that stuff. And that was his day job, really. He had done a couple of things before that. I think right after he came back from the war, he worked for the Oxford English Dictionary. Yeah,
that's right.
He actually wrote a bunch of entries for the W section of the OED. So if you have a copy of the OED, wow, adopt me. But if you can get it online, and you can look up some of the W's in like walrus and walnut, and these are entries that they're still Tolkien's entries. They've been edited a little bit over the years, but they're still fundamentally Tolkien's entries. He taught in Leeds for a few years, but then he went to Oxford in 1925. Yeah.
Yep. That's when he was a professor of Anglo-Saxon at Pembroke. Yeah.
And that's where he remained. And I mean, it's funny, we talked about this letter not too long ago on the show, I think, Alan. Tolkien never really thought of himself as a successful academic.
No.
There's that letter he wrote to one of his sons, I think it was Michael, towards the end of his life, and he joked about how he didn't realize he was a successful professor until after he retired. And there's kind of an image of him as this sort of flighty dreamer of a professor who was shirking his responsibilities and sitting around writing about hobbits instead of doing real work. But the truth is, he was really, really busy as a professor. And I mean, if you look at one of our favorite reference works, which is the Chronology by Hammond and Scull, which is basically just a listing of important dates and important events chronologically through Tolkien's life, you see that he was always attending meetings and lectures and administrative discussions at Oxford. I mean, he was really, really busy on top of his work as a teacher and as a lecturer. And, well, I guess that kind of brings me to one of his most important lectures as an academic, which was really sort of the foundational essay on Beowulf scholarship, which is Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics. He did that one in 1936, and it really sort of laid the foundation for every Beowulf scholarship that has come after it, is my understanding.
Yeah.
I am not a medievalist myself, but I understand that's sort of...
Yeah, from talking with Dr. Olson and with
Michael Drout
and a few others who are very well versed in the Beowulf tradition as well as in medievalism in general. It is far and away, this sort of seminal piece that changed the way Beowulf research Beowulf scholarship
Yeah.
was conducted.
And Beowulf appreciation too, because I mean, he was really
Oh, yeah.
he was really the first scholar to treat the Beowulf poem as a poem and read it as a story and a work of literature and something that's meant to be enjoyed. It's meant to be
Right.
enjoyed because there's a dragon in it and because there's a giant monster in it, not despite those things. And
Right.
I think it's safe to say that every bit of Beowulf scholarship since then has either been built on that or has been a reaction against it. So definitely an important piece of work. So I guess Anglo-Saxon or Old English was sort of his main focus. He did a lot of work on Middle English as well. He did some work on Chaucer. He did some work on Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. He actually edited a major scholarly edition of it in Middle English, without translating it. But then he also wrote a translation of it, which you can buy in a volume with a couple of other Middle English poem translations, Pearl and Sir
Orfeo. Yeah.
Pearl and Sir Orfeo, yeah. And so yeah, he did Old English primarily, but also some Middle English. What else, Alan? I mean, as I'm thinking of lectures, I guess we have to talk about On Fairy Stories, don't we?
That's the one that I was going to, right? On Fairy Stories, which was, again, just seminal in terms of establishing the fantasy genre and defining it in many ways. And it's the piece that we can go back to. It's a very interesting piece to look at chronologically when you realize it took place between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Because when you read it, you start to see how his deeper understanding of the genre and his, the more thought that he's poured into it, created a very different feel for The Lord of the Rings than for The Hobbit. And even though he covers that with the frame narrative and there are quote unquote in-universe reasons for why The Lord of the Rings has this different tone, you realize that as an author, he did that because he understood the significance and importance of certain concepts that he really fleshed out on Fairy Stories, which, again, we talked about how we covered the Silmarillion in season 1 to give people a foundation for The Lord of the Rings. Well, we actually covered On Fairy Stories in episode 1 to give people a foundation for all of the Legendarium for that exact reason.
And then it wasn't until the beginning of season 3 that we actually covered the Beowulf essay on our show. And I think
that's right.
The two of those essays together, one written in 1936 and one written in 1939. And as you said, Alan, both of them coming in between the composition of The Hobbit and the composition of The Lord of the Rings. That combination, and if I can borrow some words and phrases from Verlin Flieger, who's one of our favorite scholars, who we've had on the show before, and we've cited some of her works on the show. This sort of the antitheses of these two essays, the Beowulf essay and the Fairy Stories essay, because one is this very grim Germanic work of literature, and the other is about fairy stories. And the interplay between those ideas really is kind of the secret sauce that turned The Hobbit, the world of The Hobbit, into the world of Lord of the Rings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Well, let's just focus in on that for a moment. So, first of all, if someone doesn't know what the Silmarillion, what is that, and where does that fit in with the entire idea of Middle Earth? How did Tolkien go about constructing all of these major works?
Well, the second question might be too big to answer in a single episode, let alone a single season even. But the first part I can answer. The Silmarillion...
There are 12 volumes of books answering that question. But
the history of Middle Earth, it's huge. It would take us decades.
Yeah.
The Silmarillion itself was a volume published in 1977, so it was 4 years after Tolkien had died. It was put together by his son, Christopher, who was the literary executor of Tolkien's estate, and who himself, unfortunately, recently passed away as well. He has done tremendous work in bringing his father's work to the public.
Yeah.
I can't even begin to tell you how much the Tolkien world is in debt to Christopher Tolkien. Because we wouldn't have anything past The Lord of the Rings if it weren't for him.
We wouldn't have most of what we have,
Right. Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and that's it, pretty much. We would have had Smith of Wooten Major. We would have had a few others. But so Christopher put together the Silmarillion from notes that his father had written, and it is, for the most part, Tolkien's own words. Christopher did have to fill in a couple of places here and there, and he talks about that in the history of Middle-earth and how, maybe with some more time he would have made it a little bit different. But for the most part, these are stories that Tolkien had created much earlier than The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And they also take place chronologically earlier than those stories. The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings take place in something called the Third Age of Middle-earth. And the Silmarillion starts at the beginning of time. It literally begins with what you would call Genesis 1, really. It's there was nothing. There was Eru, the one whom the elves call Iluvatar. And that's it. And he then makes these angelic beings, and then together they do this music, and it creates the vision of the world, and then Eru makes the world real, because he has the power to do that. And then these angelic beings become something called the Valar, or the powers of the world. They go into the world, and they kind of run it for him. And it's very, very consistent with his own beliefs. He explained many times in his letters that he designed this system to be consistent with somebody who believes in Christianity, who believes in monotheism. And he wanted it to fit with that. And so we made it fit with that. But what's amazing
it's
about
actually
that
brilliant. If I may interject,
please.
Alan, it's actually
That's
brilliant.
exactly where I was going to lean to you.
Good.
Yeah.
It's brilliant the way he did that, because he was a Catholic and he did believe in one God, the Holy Trinity and all of that. But he also was a fan of, and when I say fan, I mean a scholar and somebody who deeply felt in his soul a love for Germanic languages and Germanic literature. And so that idea of many gods, Odin and Thor and Baldur and all those things, this was a way for him to bring together that monotheistic and that polytheistic world. So he creates this idea of Eru the One, Iluvatar, the one God, and he is the one God, capital G. But then the Valar take this place of, like Alan said, they're angelic beings. Tolkien, in one of his essays, called them demiurges, which is a fancy word for the ones who do the shaping based on the creator's plan. Right. And that's kind of the role they play. They're kind of like they serve a role similar to the little g gods of traditional mythologies. And so you've got,
with each one having a realm, right?
Right. So you've got Manwe, who's the lord of the air, and you've got Ulmo, who's the lord of the sea, and Aule, who's the lord of the earth, and Yavanna, who's the lady of trees and vegetation and animals. And so they each have a very traditional kind of domain similar to gods in polytheistic religions, but they're all sub-created, well, they're all created beings with sub-creative power given to them by Eru the One. And so that's how he manages to...
Who is the only self-existent...
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
And so that's how he manages to strike that balance.
And it's really a phenomenal thing.
It is, yeah.
Yeah. And it is a great balance, because people who don't come from his worldview can enjoy it immensely. They don't feel like they're being told that this, you must shoehorn your beliefs, to match with mine before you can enjoy this story. It's not the case at all. But it takes place all the way back there, and then it goes all the way through what we would call the First Age, which is this period of Middle-earth long before the history of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. The continent is different. There's a whole different part of the land called Beleriand in this tale that eventually gets sunk under the sea in the War of Wrath when Sauron's boss gets destroyed. Sauron, as bad as he is in The Lord of the Rings...
Sauron had a boss, folks, yeah.
He had a boss who was a lot worse. And so the Silmarillion is this tale of the First Age. And with its epilogue, Akalabeth, the Second Age as well, at least through the eyes of the Númenóreans. So, which is, they're the ancestors of the men.
Yeah, exactly. For anyone who's interested in the elves of The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, that's the primary focus of the Silmarillion. It really is.
Yes, it is.
Principally the story of the elves. It is an elvish history. It is an elvish history relayed by men, but now I'm getting way too technical with it.
Well, right. And there's nary a hobbit in sight. Not a single hobbit in there.
Yeah. And I think, like Frodo gets like one mention on like nearly the last page.
In an epilogue, right.
Right, yeah. But it's all about the elves, and in Tolkien's mythology, the elves were the firstborn children of Iluvatar, and the men were the secondborn children of Iluvatar. And so the elves came first, and they created all the beautiful things they created, and they built these amazing cities, and they went to war with Morgoth, the original Dark Lord, Sauron's old boss.
Right.
And eventually they have to move aside and make way for the dominion of men. And the Silmarillion is really sort of their time, and men sort of come into it maybe a little bit before halfway through. And then men start to kind of filter into the stories, and it gradually, Tolkien himself described the stories as gradually kind of coming down from this very sort of kind of the Genesis and the biblical level down to more of a heroic romance kind of level. So the stories kind of shift. It kind of
goes from legendary to mythic to heroic. It moves
exactly.
From
That's a really good way of saying
these different scales. Yeah. It's pretty amazing stuff. So that's kind of in a nutshell. And I know that, boy, I don't know that if you'd asked me an hour ago whether I could have given you a 5-minute synopsis of the Silmarillion, I don't think I would have been able to. But that really is it in a nutshell. And all of that stuff was background for him when he wrote The Lord of the Rings. And you see bits and pieces of that come through. One of my favorite moments that we'll get to in a few seasons is the ride of the Rohirrim at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. And the narrator describes Theoden leading the charge of the horsemen down to battle with the orcs as like Orome riding in his wrath. Nobody knew who Orome was when
who's
the Lord of the Rings
Orome?
was
Right.
published.
Yeah, it's like, who's Orome?
Who's
What
this
are you talking
Orome
about?
guy?
Yeah.
And when you read the Silmarillion, all of a sudden that's fleshed out and you see so much more depth. And these little bits and pieces of what we would call textual ruins, and that's a phrase that I believe Professor Drought came up with, that kind of hint at a deeper history. They get filled in and you get to find out about them. And yet there are still more textual ruins. So there's always that hint of something deeper. Yeah, it's great.
And as you're talking about that, Alan, we were talking a moment ago about the difference between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And that's another thing that you see that's different between those two of his major works, which is in The Hobbit, every once in a while, the world of the Silmarillion just kind of surfaces a little bit.
Yep.
So
when he finds Sting and we talk about Gondolin. Yeah.
When Bilbo finds his sword and Elrond identifies it as a sword from Gondolin. Gondolin is one of those big elvish cities that I was just talking about from the Silmarillion.
Yes.
Or when you get to the description of Mirkwood and the elves of Mirkwood, and Tolkien goes on this little digression about the 3 kindreds of elves who went to Faerie in the West.
The deep elves, the sea elves, and the high elves. Yeah.
That is all stuff that's told in the Silmarillion. But it seems at times he was almost more inspired by himself when he was writing The Hobbit, as opposed to explicitly trying to tie The Hobbit into that world of the Silmarillion.
Yeah.
By the time he was writing Lord of the Rings, he was actively telling a story that was a sequel to the Silmarillion. He was actively bringing that stuff in, and he was actively trying to create a story that existed in that world.
Which is why he had to retcon the entirety of Chapter 5 in The Hobbit. When you go from the first edition of The Hobbit that was published in 1937 to the second edition, which was, Shawn, I want to say 1950, 51? I may be wrong, and I know we've got a lot of book experts who'll be able to tell me.
That sounds about right.
Somewhere in that time frame, he converted Chapter 5, and that's the chapter where Bilbo finds the ring and has his riddle game with Gollum. And it changes substantively the nature of the ring. And that's because when he was drafting The Lord of the Rings, he knew he had to go back and fix this and make the ring the connection between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and bring The Hobbit into the world of Middle-earth created for the Silmarillion. And that's why now it creates this whole, but at the same time, The Hobbit always feels just a little bit different as a result.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I think we now understand everything about Middle-earth.
Our job here is done, Shawn. How in the world do you do that when we've spent 175 episodes and we're barely halfway through even halfway through Lord of the Rings?
I don't know why it takes you guys so long normally. You clearly need to come on the show more often. You get it done so much
Too many
quicker.
digressions, I guess. Too many jokes.
But now we've spoken about Middle-earth. Tolkien also wrote other books, and recently, I've read very few of them, but the one that I did recently read was Leaf by Niggle, and that was delightful. Are there any other of his works that would be good first-time reads for people who are just getting into Tolkien?
Leaf by Niggle is actually a great one. I think it because it tells you so much about Tolkien as a man as well, and as a writer. It is such a rich story, and yet it's an easy read. It's one of those things where you'll keep discovering things every time you read it. It's deeply moving, and it's my actual favorite non-legendarium work, though I know Shawn is going to tell us about something else, his favorite non-legendarium work.
I am, but I'm going to say that for anybody who has read, let's say somebody's read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, maybe they're not sure they're ready for the Silmarillion, or they've read the Silmarillion and they're not sure they want to dive into the history of Middle-earth, but they want to read some of his other stuff. I think pick up a volume called Tales from the Perilous Realm. That's an anthology of shorter works.
Yes, absolutely. It contains a lot of these.
Yeah, it's an anthology of shorter works. It has Leaf by Niggle in it. It also has a nice tie back to Middle-earth because it's got a collection of poems called The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, only 2 of which are actually about Tom Bombadil, and no, they do not tell you what or who he actually is.
No, they don't.
But there's some great poems in there, and there's a really fun one called Farmer Giles of Ham, which is a hilarious story about a dragon hunter. But then there's my favorite, which is Smith of Wootton Major, which is it's actually the last story that Tolkien wrote that he saw published in his lifetime. It was published in 1967, I believe, really close to the end of his life. And it started as a preface to another fantasy work. And then it just became its own story about the nature of fairy. And it's another one of those stories that kind of puts into practice some of his ideas from On Fairy Stories about the nature of fairy. And it's about this character named Smith who finds a passport into the fairy realm and just the effect it has on his life. And it's beautiful. It's kind of sad in a way. I think Tolkien himself said it was kind of sad. It was written by an older man near the end of his life, but it's beautiful and it's poignant, and it's also a lot of fun, really, despite sort of a sad undertone. So yeah, there's a lot of great stuff in Tales from the Perilous Realm for somebody who's interested in Tolkien, but maybe not ready to dive into the deep end of Middle Earth, of which there is a lot.
Yeah. I would recommend, though, if somebody's going to read Smith of Wootton Major, I love the idea of Tales of the Perilous Realm, but there's actually a standalone edition of that put out, I think, in about 2005, 2006, that Dr. Flieger wrote the notes for. It's a critical edition of Smith of Wootton Major, and that is really insightful. Gives you, I think, a great viewpoint on the story itself. So
yeah, some really good essays in there, and also the original Pauline Baines illustrations, which are not in Tales from the Perilous Realm.
That's correct.
Ah. Well, you just spoke about going deeper into Tolkien, and that's really my last major question, because when I listen to you guys talk about Tolkien, I'm always amazed at how much you know. You talk about etymologies, Tolkien's languages, which we've barely scratched in this talk, but Tolkien developed full languages, and you seem familiar with them and understand them. And so basically what I want to know is, how do we all become experts?
Listen to our show? No. Well, I think this as a podcaster. You know that when you're about to talk about something, you dive deep into that and you grab the material. A lot of that is stuff that we don't have off the top of our heads. If we were in a conversation at a pub, I might remember something about something that led me to think X or Y, but I wouldn't have handy the actual text of that etymology. It wouldn't be in my brain. But I do know how to find it. I do know that there's going to be something deeper out there. And so for us, it's just a matter of preparation. But, we don't have that encyclopedic knowledge on hand all the time, to be fair.
It's a matter of an embarrassingly large bookcase full of Tolkien books and knowing which one to look in at any given time.
That is correct. Yeah. And that's really what it has boiled down to.
And a lot of it is just sort of magpieing stuff you find along the way. Some of the best linguistic material that you find on Tolkien, Alan's going to laugh because I keep going back to
Parma El de Lamberon 17.
There's a series of linguistic journals that have been published posthumously that people in the Tolkien fan community have published with Christopher Tolkien's permission. They've gotten access to all these linguistic papers and they've published them posthumously. An editor named Christopher Gilson has been putting this stuff out for years, and a lot of those things are out of print. You kind of have to hunt them down, and there's one issue in particular, number 17, which I keep going back to on our show because it's got glosses for virtually every Elvish word in Lord of the Rings, and it's sometimes it's a little bit of work to track those down on the internet, but if you look hard enough on eBay and things like that, you can find them out there. But yeah, I mean that's really I couldn't agree with Alan more. I think we have read quite a bit, and we kind of remember. Oh yeah, this is in this particular book. Oh, this was in Tom Shippey's book, Road to Middle Earth, or whatever. And so it's just about pulling up those texts and having that information in front of us when we record the show.
Yeah, it's just really just knowing how to be good researchers, finding the information even if we don't know it in the first place. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's also finding that particular little hook that you love and that makes you want to dig deeper. So again, whether it's the languages or whether it's the history of the elves or whatever, Find that one thing, dig deep on that, and as you're doing that, I promise you will find little side paths and side roads that you can go down and find out more about something you didn't even know was in there. It's really just about, finding what it is that makes you passionate about Tolkien's work and reading deeper into that. And there is a ton of information out there. And as we've said, we've got links to a lot of it on our site.
In a way, we're very surfacey. I know that sounds crazy to say that, but we actually don't cover it as in-depth as it could be covered. We could easily spend 5 times the amount of time we do because there's always so much to talk about. People who write academic papers on one little niche thing that we could spend an entire episode talking about. We don't, because we do want this to be general audience. We want it to be entertaining to a broad scope of people. And we love knowing that we're presenting Tolkien in a way that first-time readers can still enjoy, as well as near experts. Because there are people out there, let's be honest, there are listeners who know a lot more about
who know more than
certain
we do.
individual
Absolutely.
topics.
Yeah.
We're generalists.
Yep.
We have to know a lot about everything, but there are people who are going to know a lot more than us on one particular thing. You know, it might be the history of Middle-earth, or it might be an Elvish language, or it might be something practical, like when we talked about mithril armor, and we ended up hearing from people who are actual armorers and who know how to make armor, or, physicists who can talk to us about, arrows and spears and how they impact. I mean, we're always going to hear from experts who know more than us. So knowing that you're never going to be the expert you want to be is a good place to start, but then recognizing you can lean on those people and find them is another one.
And I think that's another great resource is the people who are out there. There are, I know there's a ton of different Tolkien fan groups out there. But if you find the right ones, like, the Tolkien Society, or, there's a handful of really good subreddits out there. And if you listen to the right people, you'll know which ones know what they're talking about. Talk to those people.
Yeah, you'll figure that out pretty quickly.
Some of them are actual published scholars in the field of Tolkien studies who have a Twitter account or who post on Reddit. And you start talking to those people, you find out there's a lot of really smart people out there who know their stuff and who just love talking about this stuff. So
I have to not think about that when we record, or I'm intimidated because there are so many people out there who are so much smarter than we are. Yeah.
But we're such nice guys that people tend to like us even when we make a mistake.
That helps.
Well, it's part of the reason why in the introduction to our podcast, we emphasize the fact that we're amateurs. So any mistakes that we make, it's like, we didn't train in this. It's okay.
Yeah, it is kind of what we do. I don't think we call that out much anymore, but
we're passionate amateurs. Absolutely.
Yeah, but we're always willing to correct ourselves on the air. It just usually takes us about 6 weeks to get around to it because of the way our production schedule runs. So by the time somebody hears an episode, finds a mistake, gets to us and tells us this was a mistake and here's why, well, we can put it in our next recording, but that might not be out for another month. So,
right.
I will say the one thing I'm still waiting for, though, is for Quenya or Sindarin to be on Duolingo.
Oh, wouldn't that be nice?
I think that would really help me.
That would be so
I would
cool.
actually buy a subscription instead of just using the free version right there.
That would be super cool. I would spend so much time there if that were the case.
I actually think there is a viable business model for that, because I've spoken to a lot of people who really love Tolkien and they've tried learning the languages and they've just found the resources out there a little bit too hard, a little bit too dry. Mm-hmm. So if anyone has any connections with Duolingo, send me an email. I think we need to make this happen.
That would be awesome.
Awesome.
Aure and Tuluva. The day shall come. The day shall come again. That would be great.
Okay, so during Tolkien Month, I'm ending every interview with a simple quiz. I'll give you guys 2 options, and all you have to do is choose your preferred option.
Okay.
Okay. Sounds easy.
You ready?
Yep.
Okay, here we go. Tea or coffee?
I prefer tea, but I do drink coffee for medicinal purposes because I have kids.
Medicinal purposes. That's great. I actually, this is terrible. I'm not a hot beverage guy. I really, things I drink should be cool. Sorry. Water?
Dude,
I guess
you can get iced tea and coffee.
I know. I could get, actually, yes. There we go. Iced coffee then.
Elves or dwarves?
Elves.
Yeah, elves.
Early bird or night owl?
I am a night owl.
Not sure anymore. I guess I'm still an early bird, though. This quarantine thing has really changed my sleeping patterns. So, but I'm sure I'll go back to being an early bird again later.
Gandalf or Radagast?
Gandalf.
Oh yeah, Gandalf in a heartbeat.
Call or text?
Text.
I'm old school. Call.
Tom Bombadil, wonderful or wretched?
Wonderful. But I was I was on Wretched at one time, I will admit. Folks who have listened to our show know that. It took me a while to come along to Tom Bombadil, but yes, wonderful.
I'd find a W in the middle called weird, but between those two, I'll go with wonderful.
Oh, I need to add that. Okay. iPhone or Android?
iPhone.
iPhone, yeah.
That's good. There's nothing sadder than when you send a new friend a text and the bubble goes green.
I know!
I know.
That's terrible. I'm like, oh, wow.
Yeah, it's like, do I just delete the number now?
Yeah. That is so true.
I'm sorry, we can't be friends. There are some divides that can't be crossed.
That's right. I guess we'll have to use Messenger now because I'm not going to text you.
Yeah.
When my fiance and I first started dating, it was kind of like Romeo and Juliet because I was iPhone, she was Android.
Oh, boy. Yeah.
Don't worry, she came over to the light side fairly quickly.
Well, I'm pleased to hear that.
Good.
It's an expensive light side, but it's the light side for sure.
It is.
It is. It's. I think it's very elfish. Everything. It takes more time and energy and cost, but everything is so beautiful.
It is.
It just works.
Yeah, there's an elegance to it.
iPhone versus Android is kind of like the elves versus the dwarves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is an interesting parallel. I won't disagree. Yeah.
Somebody needs to write a paper about that. Okay, moving on. Pippin or Merry?
Merry.
Ooh, yeah. Merry is a little bit wiser. I do tend to like Merry a little bit better.
It's the Rohirrim thing. I love the Rohirrim connection, and I'm the Lord of the Mark, so I have to go with Merry.
Yeah.
Shelob or Nazgul?
Ooh. To hang out with?
Neither one.
Nazgul. I think they're certainly more interesting. Yeah.
Man, I shouldn't have let you go first on all of these, Shawn, because I feel like I'm just parroting your answers, but Nazgul. I mean, one Nazgul could take out Shelob in a heartbeat.
Well, we always agree, Alan. You know this.
I know. Everybody criticizes us for always agreeing, but yeah. Definitely Nazgul over Shelob, sure.
Okay, well, here's a divisive question. Second breakfast or 11s?
Is this where we introduce the two terms that we accidentally came up with?
No, best if we don't.
No, inside joke we'll leave inside, yes.
I think 11s just because I'm not really hungry enough for second breakfast, but by 11s I might be able to, to enjoy a muffin, a mimosa, something like that,
Well, the sad thing is I'm doing a lot of intermittent fasting, so lunch is at 11:30 and I don't eat before then. But on a good day when I'm actually eating, I would say second breakfast because who's going to turn down bacon a second time?
Smart man.
Well, you didn't say there was bacon, but yeah.
Oh, well, there you go. If it's a breakfast, there's bacon. If there's no bacon, it's not breakfast. It's just a waffle or something.
Actually, as an aside, I don't think I've ever come across any confirmation of this, but I'm convinced that Tolkien modeled the Hobbit meals after the Liturgy of the Hours of the Catholic Church. They all mirror up perfectly.
Really?
That's a fascinating thing. I'm going to have to look into that. I don't have a background in Catholicism, so I would not have noticed that. But boy, I'm going to have to dig into that. The Liturgy of the Hours. That's going to be an interesting little study.
That does sound fascinating. I think we need to.
Thank you for another digression.
Well, if you can prove it, it'll be very satisfying because this is what my gut tells me, and when we're speaking about meals, I always follow my gut.
Well, yes.
Well said.
Follow your nose, Pippin.
Okay, Boromir or Faramir?
Faramir.
I'm going first here.
Heartbeat.
Faramir. Yeah. Faramir is my favorite character in the entire Legendarium, so yeah, Faramir.
He's close to mine.
Yeah.
Okay, you'll appreciate this next one. Balrogs, wings or wingless?
Oh, tell me you heard our show. That's like asking us, is Feanor good or is he a villain? I mean, come on. Balrogs do not have wings in any way, shape, or form. Just metaphorical wings.
That's a big no on wings.
Yeah.
Bagels or croissant?
Croissant.
Why do I let you go first, Shawn? You're always taking my answer. Croissant. But I don't say it like a Frenchman because Tolkien wouldn't say it croissant.
Because Tolkien wasn't a fan
Crescent.
of the French language.
No, he didn't. He detested French food. In one of his letters, that's what he talks about. I detest French food.
Well, I don't, and I love croissants.
I love crescents. I like crescent rolls, yeah. With bacon and eggs, breakfast crescents.
Can't argue with that.
All right, I'm pulling you guys in. Okay, we got 5 more to go. The movies or the book?
Oh,
the books.
the books. Yeah.
Arwen or Eowyn?
Eowyn. My absolute favorite character in Lord of the Rings. Yeah.
Yeah, on this one, I'm going to have to go Arwen.
Do we disagree about something? That's amazing.
We just did, yeah. We also disagreed about Second Breakfast or 11s, but you didn't seem to notice that.
That's true. No, I didn't. Well, you're right. Talking about Eowyn, that's all.
This is good. I'm stoking up controversy for your podcast.
I appreciate that very much. We're going to have to put that on Twitter and start a war. All right.
Rivendell or Lothlorien?
I'll go Rivendell. I'll say it first.
I almost always say Rivendell. We have spent a lot of time in Lothlorien in our show recently because we've just gotten through that part of the book, and I've found a love for Lothlorien that I didn't always have, but I think I'm still Rivendell.
Yeah, I'm definitely Rivendell. At Lothlorien, the hard part is you're kind of by yourself. Nobody speaks your language, and the only time you ever get invited to anything with your host is right when you're leaving. So I prefer the last homely house.
But you do get a party favor.
Yeah, that's
true.
That is true.
They do give nice parting gifts.
Unless you're Boromir, Merry, or Pippin, in which case you get a nice little belt. That's nice. I got the killer bow, the biggest bow they ever made, and it's strung with elf hair. I got a sheath for my sword that has its name in jewels.
Somebody needs to do the Charlie Brown Christmas special with that,
Seriously, or the Halloween special. Charlie Brown reaches into the bag instead of pulling out rocks.
Yeah,
I got a rock. I got a belt.
Okay, last 2. Gollum or Jar Jar Binks?
Oh, goodness. Which one do I want to kill more? Which one do I want to tie to the front of my car and drive at a very high speed for a long period of time?
Gollum. Just because my kids like when I do my Gollum voice. My kids don't like it when I do my Jar Jar voice.
Misa not like your Jar Jar voice, son. Nobody like your Jar Jar voice. Misa think that voice terrible.
Misa think you're a great Jedi.
I cannot. Here's the thing. I would pick Gollum because at least he has some redeeming characteristics.
There you go. Solid answer.
He killed babies, but he's not Jar Jar Binks.
That's right. He didn't kill a movie franchise.
Just his best friend on his birthday.
All right, fair enough.
All right, last one. Tolkien or Lewis?
Oh, come on.
I am sorry.
I love Lewis. But you can't ask us that question.
I know we're in your house, David, but Tolkien.
Yeah. Like I said, I love Lewis. I really do. And if I'm going to read, especially if I'm going to read nonfiction, I'm going to read a lot of Lewis's stuff. I'm impressed as can be with his thinking, with the way he lays out an argument. But I'm going to pick Tolkien every time between the two of them.
It's allowed.
Good.
Gentlemen, thanks again for coming on the show.
Our pleasure.
An hour is too short a time to be spent chatting with such excellent and admirable men as yourselves.
Oh, well done.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
To wrap up, can you please tell listeners where they can go and find out more about you and listen to your podcast?
Absolutely. You can go to our website, theprancingponypodcast.com. You can go to our Facebook page, which is also The Prancing Pony Podcast. And then on Twitter and Instagram, we are at Prancing Pony Pod. And you can also find us on Reddit, where we have a really active subreddit with something like 6,000 members now at r/Prancing Pony Pod.
That's right.
And you can find us even on Android devices, by the way. I just want you to know that we are available on that substandard platform.
Although, be warned, the text will be harder to read.
We are everywhere you find podcasts. We're on Stitcher.
Correct.
We're on Spotify. We're on
TuneIn.
Yeah.
You can listen to us on Alexa through TuneIn. So if you want to say, Alexa, play the Prancing Pony Podcast on TuneIn, you have to add that, I think.
We're going to say that again really clearly. Alexa, play the Prancing Pony Podcast.
Yeah,
there you
on
go.
TuneIn.
Little gift.
Yeah. We actually ordered paper towels for some of our listeners once when we were joking about Alexa. And we said something like, Alexa, order paper towels. And the next thing you know, we had people emailing us saying, thanks a lot. Alexa, put paper towels in my cart. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I'd like to thank my guests again, as well as our Patreon supporters, particularly our top-tier supporters of John, Kate, and Rowdy. Listeners, please come back next week when we'll be heading down the Tolkien road with 2 other podcasters and spending quite some time with the Silmarillion. Then we'll continue going further up
and further in.
Cheers.
Cheers.